President Barack Obama says he still believes in the politics of hope. Should he? Should you? We'll talk about that next on Capitol View. Nine years to the day that he declared he was going to run for president, Barack Obama, yes, finishing his final year in that office, came back to Springfield, where he gave a speech to a joint session of the Illinois General Assembly and seemed to encourage a new form of civic discourse and a path forward for government that hits on his initial promises of hope and of change. I'm Amanda Vinicky, State House Bureau Chief for Illinois Public Radio and WUIS, and this is an awesome all-star radio panel today on Capitol View. So for starters here, we've got my colleague Brian Mackey of WUIS and also Illinois Issues magazine. And then we have Dave Dahl of WTAX, their Capitol reporter. So fellas, this was historic. There have been only 4 other presidents that addressed a joint session of the General Assembly while they were sitting as presidents. So I thought this was interesting. Talked to director of the state archives and learned about who all that was. We had William Howard Taft, we had Herbert Hoover, and then also about some 40 years ago, President Jimmy Carter. But of course, Obama's different. He's from the state of Illinois. He'd served in the Illinois State Senate, so this was a sort of homecoming. And also, they were running for office, or early on in their presidencies. This is kind of the start of Obama's winding down, a retirement tour of sorts. Let's get started and refresh people who weren't able to be in the Capitol because it was closed to the public or didn't catch the speech live on any of our radio outlets. But what did he say? Let's start with you, Dave.
Well, I think the big takeaway for me is he was having an awful lot of fun up there. He truly enjoyed being back in the Illinois State Capitol, back among friends, among people who knew him when, and that's what someone I interviewed told me was really the difference between that and almost any other speech he's given. He was like he was back in the neighborhood, and he was, again, putting down the points of taking the financial influence out of campaigning, taking the meanness out of politics, and trying to do some redistricting. And really, there was a little bit of Barack Obama for everybody. Governor Rauner could say, yeah, he's with me on redistricting, so there, yeah. And someone who's a Democrat might say, yeah, but he's with me on making it easier for people to vote, so there. So just about everybody can claim their little piece of the president.
Let's get back to his specific elements for change in a bit, but I want to touch on what you said was noticeable, and that was just his level of comfort, how it was back with almost family. There were a lot of shout outs to people that he had served with. He really talked about playing poker. There was a follow-up interview with the Tribune's Christy Parsons and 3 former state senators that had served with him, and he talked about how he was able to win in these poker games because he was slow drinking his beer while the other guys weren't, and that helped him to win and has paid for his 2 daughters. It got their scholarship, college funds off to a good start. So I mean, it really was familiar. Brian, can you tell me maybe a little bit more about that, and how we were able to get that feeling?
It's kind of remarkable to think about when the president leaves office, he will have been president for about as long as he was in the Illinois legislature, 8 years. And it's, if you were one of the people who served with him, I talked to House Republican leader Jim Duncan before the speech, and he said, you know, I used to call him Barack. We would call each other. We worked on bills. We worked on, in his phrase, capital punishment reform before it was a cool issue. And this is before George Ryan had commuted the sentences even. So, I mean, or around that time. I mean, this is, there are people out there that know him really well and knew him when he was just another guy down the hall trying to get his bills passed, and he wasn't the leader of the free world. And I asked Republican leader Jim Duncan, you know, is that surreal? What's that like? And he said, you need a word beyond surreal even to describe that feeling of now this is somebody you knew, now he's the president. And I think if you turn around, you go to the podium and you think of it from the president's standpoint, right now, all his aides, the first generation of aides that came with him through the election that he's known for a long time, most of them have moved on. He did have David Axelrod and Valerie Jarrett with him on this trip, but he's surrounded by a lot of people, a lot of young people who have only known him as Mr. President, the great liberal hope of hope and change. And so he looks out in this room and he sees people who know him as a human being and not just as this leader of the free world. And that must have been, it apparently set him at ease enough that he could make these jokes with people and really be a person that we have not really seen very much of while in office, at least not on a national stage.
Right. He talked in that subsequent interview that I mentioned about the isolation of the presidency, and so I imagine it was freeing. And as I think really we have to talk about this, so it was clearly not the point of the speech, but it is interesting because of how much it touches on what he was supposed to be talking about. So this speech is about the politics of hope, as I'd noted, and why it is that government, both in Washington, D.C. and in so many state houses, has become so polarized, so partisan, and what can be done about it. And as one of these kind of familiar, off the cuff, he's clearly back at home and comfortable, he had a sentence where he said, just because I'm working with somebody from the other party doesn't mean that I'm a sellout. Compromise isn't a bad thing. And you heard somebody shout, Dave, I know you and I were in the gallery, and it was audible, somebody say, yeah, that's right. And I wasn't able to see initially, but I do believe that this was actually Representative Ken Duncan, a Chicago Democrat, and he stood up. And what is fascinating to me about this, and I'll have you explain kind of what went down after that, but keep this in mind that this is the President of the United States, and why this caused such a ruckus is a very local, as in state local, issue. So who wants to take that? What was this uproar that got people laughing, cheering, standing, and really going wild that wasn't even in the prepared comments?
Yeah, it united everybody. Everybody against Ken Duncan.
Against Ken Duncan.
I think in a thumbnail you could say that Duncan is a Chicago Democrat. He happens to be African American. He boasts that he grew up in Cabrini Green. If he were here with us, God help us, if he were here with us, he'd say, my district goes from the Gold Coast to the Soul Coast. And he might do
a little dance alongside.
He has
not kidding.
Made a spectacle out of being aligned now with Governor Rauner and not with the House leadership and Speaker Mike Madigan. And I think it might have been misreported that he has voted against some things that they wanted. In reality, on at least one day's worth of cases, he was absent.
Right.
He cast no vote at all because he wasn't there. And the conspiracy theorists say that, Bruce Rauner sent him on vacation or what have you. But the fact of the matter is, Representative Duncan believes that he doesn't have to go along with the Speaker, that possibly there's something to gain later, either for his constituents or, a skeptic would say, for himself, to do Rauner's bidding and be the one House Democrat who's going against the grain, who is fouling up the mathematical supermajority. And really, the way I've been reporting it is that Duncan has become a pariah in his own caucus. And so I think if I can read what the president was jiving him about, there's a difference between what the president was saying opposing someone and doing what Duncan did, which wasn't necessarily on principle, it could be argued, but just cynically seeing what you can get for yourself. I think what the president might have been saying, as I claim my own part of President Obama now, I think the president might have been saying when he said, I'll talk to you later, Duncan, sit down. I think what he was saying was, that's not what I was talking about. That's not what I just said. When I said,
don't mince my words, don't twist my words.
Exactly. I really wasn't talking about you, Ken. You're not the example. And so when
and how dare you stand up and try to claim that?
And when the president called him out like that, and I must admit, for being in the gallery, I had a terrible view. I mean, I would have had to stand up and look over to see.
Which we weren't allowed to do. I was also in the gallery, but lots of rules in covering this.
So we heard it was Duncan. We heard his voice, but I couldn't see him from where I was sitting. So nevertheless, so he's calling out Ken Duncan, and everybody, and it was almost like a State of the Union, as the president intimated, and as we were mentioning in the gallery, it's either all the Democrats or all the Republicans giving applause. And this was one time where everyone was together against Duncan. And Duncan is the sort of fellow who believes that there's no such thing as bad publicity. And so, of course, he's immediately claiming, oh, yeah, the president confirms, what I'm doing all along.
Right, on his Facebook page, he made note of that and seemed to say that he got special attention from Barack Obama. But and there are some. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, I was just saying, one of the things that I think was so fun for people in the room and for Illinois, people who are so steeped, this is such an inside Illinois issue, right? This is something that you have to wonder, is the president sitting there watching CapitolView on YouTube every week to keep up with Illinois politics?
Because he misses it?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, how...
Shout out, Mr.
Right, yes, exactly. I mean, hi there. I mean, how is he, so intimately aware of what's going on in Illinois? There were a number of, people were wondering, is the president, he's going to give this talk about a better politics, right? Is he going to come back here and lecture Illinois Democrats and particularly the Republican governor, his Democratic allies were hoping, the president's allies were hoping, on how to solve the problem here? And the president didn't do much of that. There were a few little jibes, though, that he worked in here and there. He talked about, things we can accomplish together, like educating our children, protecting our streets, passing a budget, little things like that. Little asides like that.
There was his support of labor was in there.
Right, but he. Generally, he would try to bat back the applause. Dave, you mentioned this State of the Union dynamic where half the room applauds for one thing, half the room for the other. He said, he doesn't want this to be a sit-down stand-up. He said, you know better than that, he said to the crowd, because he wants this to be part of his post-partisan agenda. He says he's going to be touring the country using his last year in office to try and get the American people on board with this idea that politics do not have to be as bitter and divisive and cable news and gotcha and tweets, that call people out on things, and just, that most Americans want some progress, and in his view at least, and they don't want this constant fighting that we see out of Washington. And as he said, that has now seeped down to the state and local level, and that certainly has paralyzed state government in Springfield.
Right, nowhere is that more evident in the place where he chose to give this speech, in the Illinois State Capitol, where there has been 8 months plus, really, because that's how long we're in our 8th month without a budget, but it took many months before that to get to the impasse. So what a place to give a budget. And again, this whole Ken Duncan episode, I think, really got to so much of what he is speaking about and the role of money in politics.
And $500,000 to Ken Duncan, by the way.
From a group that has some pretty deep connections to the Republican governor, Bruce Rauner. It's not Rauner money directly, but we think maybe, who knows, you can't tell. It's the exact dark money that the president spoke about.
And that's when Ken should have been standing up.
That's me. So all right, let's move on there to, actually, I want to, before we get to the 3 elements that were kind of Obama's prescription for curing some of these ills, he did want to mention another interesting couple of things to me. That was that, for example, Senator Kirk Dillard was in the gallery, and this is somebody who actually did reach out, compromise, and then when he tried to make a run a couple of times actually for the Republican nomination for governor, really got called out in ads for having done an ad for before he was president, for Barack Obama during a primary race, and just saying, hey, Obama's a good guy, not an endorsement or anything, but
Pew had this study a couple of years ago. I mean, the president talks about compromise as though it's a universally beloved concept and that most Americans want compromise. But Pew had this very interesting study a few years ago that said compromise is actually something that liberals tend to really like, something like 80-20, and people who identify as strongly conservative don't like the idea of compromise. They feel it's a better value is to stand up for your principles and fight compromise.
We're seeing that play out in the
and
presidential election.
Right, and so
here in our congressional district, La Hood.
Yeah, so I mean, you look at, you listen to some of the things the president said. He said, your supporters will be perennially disappointed because politicians promise these things. And I couldn't help but thinking he was talking about the campaign. Just this week, we saw Donald Trump on the Republican side, who is never going to get Mexico to pay for a border wall, right? That not many people think that is a realistic possibility. Likewise, on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders is never going to get a European single-payer healthcare system through Congress, and yet they promise these things. The supporters are going to be disappointed. The president is really calling for this more centrist notion, this compromising notion. But I think the problem is, as I was alluding to that study, not everybody thinks that compromise is a good thing.
Well, and we're seeing that play out in Illinois as well. I mean, when you think about the difficulties that have brought about this budget impasse, you hear some notion of, yes, we need revenue and cuts, but neither party has been very specific about plans for that, and that's because nobody likes cuts and nobody wants to pay more in taxes. And so it's this conundrum, and we in the media try and get it out there, but Obama had some harsh words for the media too, really just saying that the constant tweeting and glare of TV cameras has frightened lawmakers from being honest and upfront. So let's move on to what he thinks can be done about it. And there are three of them. I want to get started with, he talked about campaign finance. And this follows in the Citizen United decision, this flow of dark money. And I thought it was interesting because he talked about, you can have 150 families that are basically funding as much as the entire rest of the United States into this 2016 presidential election so far. And the 1% is kind of, buying things up. The rich should have a voice, but not the only voice. And right there in the front row is Governor Bruce Rauner, who, of course, largely propelled his own campaign and is Illinois' governor because he reached into his own wealthy pockets or that of his friends, and that's how he got here. So anything that Illinois can do about that? Or go ahead, Brian.
Well, the governor spent, I think it was $27 million of his own money to get elected, which is about what Governor Quinn spent in his defeat, right? I mean, he had so much money. It's basically a bottomless pool of money that he has to run for office. So you couldn't help but draw that connection as the president is talking about the ultra wealthy having a disproportionate, the money allows them to have a disproportionate voice through the buying of television advertisement and things like that. You couldn't help but draw that connection to the man sitting right in front of him.
Not to oversimplify, but when we talk about Rauner and his friends, it's not a lot of friends either. It's Ken Griffin.
Right.
Yeah.
A little bit of Dick Uihlein.
Yeah,
they could fit at this table.
A million here, a million there, yeah, right.
So I did notice, and there was not, of course, a lot of applause, but the governor politely clapped when he was supposed to at that. But really, there's not a ton that Illinois at least has on the forefront of addressing that, and this goes, of course, to Supreme Court decisions and changes at a deeper level, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is Citizens United was a United States Supreme Court decision. A lot of people think you need a constitutional amendment to basically say that money is not speech, because basically the Supreme Court has said that spending money is the same thing as exercising free speech, like printing pamphlets or going and standing on a street corner or spending $30 million to get yourself elected governor. It's all the same thing. And so you would really need to change the United States Constitution in order to overcome that. And that seems to be, based on where our divided politics are today, something that is not going to be happening anytime soon.
So moving on to something that perhaps could happen. There is a citizens initiative right now to put an amendment before voters in the general election that would change how legislative districts are drawn in the state of Illinois. That may not be the only proposal that we see, who knows. President Barack Obama, during his address, as he had during the State of the Union, talked about getting rid of gerrymandering on the congressional level. So this is one of those areas where you saw Republicans applause when Obama talked, something that Rauner has really embraced and been a leader on when it comes to redistricting. So Dave, can the governor say that, yeah, he's got backing from the president? Does this put pressure on Illinois Democrats to do something about how districts are drawn?
I think the Democrats in Illinois have proven to be sturdy when it comes to withstanding that kind of pressure. So I think the answer is no.
You think no, all right. And there's a difference between, of course, what Obama was talking about and this Citizens Initiative, or is there? There seems to be murky.
Yeah, the president has talked a lot. He talked about this in his State of the Union address, and that very night, United States Senator Dick Durbin was on a conference call with some Illinois reporters, and somebody asked him, can we take the president's endorsement of this idea of, independent commissions to draw maps nationally for Congress? Can we take that on endorsement of this plan that Governor Rauner is now backing in Illinois, the Citizens Initiative that would have an independent commission drawing the legislative districts? And as the president describes it, politicians should not be able to pick their voters. Voters should pick the politicians. Senator Durbin, and this was later backed up by the White House press office, saying, well, we're talking about Congress. This should not be done state by state. It needs to happen everywhere, because if California and Illinois and New York and blue states start having fairer districts, but Texas and some of the other red states don't, that's kind of a one-sided disarmament. And what they're saying is that this needs to be all or nothing. Now, the Illinois people say, this is just a concept whose time has come. The president embraces the concept. And Illinois, because Illinois' legislature, that's it. You're not talking about just putting this in Chicago and not downstate. It would be statewide. So they claim that, we can say that the president has endorsed the concept of what we want to do. We both want politicians not to pick their voters, but voters pick the politicians.
One of Obama's other answers to improving and building a better politic, as he termed it, was improving just the civil discourse by politicians about one another and about themselves and about government. But then he also had one last kind of material suggestion. This is something that has actually been introduced in Illinois, making it easier for people to vote. So, Dave.
Signing up for a driver's license, you automatically are registered to vote. That's an idea, and name checked there was Senator Menard, and I believe Representative Gable is the other one on that one. It was interesting to hear all the names that President Obama
name
mentioned.
Drop. You want to be name dropped in this case.
I was waiting for mine. Yeah. Nevertheless,
I didn't get one either for us.
Nevertheless, that's something that skews Democrat. They want more people voting. The Republicans generally want, they know that their people are going to get out regardless, and the Democrats may have a harder time with turnout, and so the conventional wisdom would be this is a left-leaning issue. Should it be easier to vote? That's something I kind of wonder about. I said to Senator Menard and the other guys had a news conference about it, and I said, it's like a Jay Leno thing. You could go to the mall or the town square or whatever, and you just really start to get discouraged at the number of people who don't know what congressional district they live in, don't know who their state rep is, don't know the name of the vice president, and those are the people who you want with a say in whether you get to come down here and be a senator again. And one of the other senators said that was quite a loaded question. Nevertheless, is voter disenfranchisement a thing? Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the question. I mean, are people...
It's deeper than meets the eye.
Are people trying to vote and getting turned away? Are people, lawfully registered and
mm-hmm.
for whatever reason not able to cast a vote? And I'm not too sure about that.
Well, we'll see if that gains any traction. And in general, whether Obama told a story about when he was doing his first bill, he was told by the then Senate leader, Pate Phillip, I think you changed a lot of minds with your speech, but I didn't think you changed any votes. Whether Obama's address will change any votes going forward remains to be seen. We have just a few minutes left of the program, and I wanted to leave the president behind for just a bit and get back to the Illinois budget. We have the Civic Federation out with a new report. Some of the highlights of that say that they suggest bringing the tax rate back up to the 5% for personal income taxes that it had been prior to just over a year ago, and that would help get Illinois' fiscal house in order. That taxing non-Social Security retirement income is part of it. They have a pension idea, including a constitutional amendment that would say for public sector pensions, you can keep what you've earned, but going forward, there is a change, because otherwise, just wait, Illinois, that bill backlog that's at about $7 billion now could reach about $26 billion come the summer of 2019. Either of you, any of this going to happen? Is this report helpful in putting in perspective how dire Illinois' budget straits are, or does this not change anything and another, pile of paper that'll go in the recycling bin?
I mean, I think to answer your questions in order, is it going to go anywhere? I think right now pretty much nothing is going anywhere, nothing of any significance. Is it helpful? I do think it's helpful because right now so much of the debate in Illinois is happening at this very abstract level. It's Rauner versus Madigan. No one's talking about the specifics of where are we going to find the revenue or cuts in government we need to balance the budget. So at least somebody is putting ideas out there in the public debate, and that's, I think, a good thing.
Well, we're going to find out Wednesday. That's the budget address, and so Governor Rauner will tell us what he has in mind.
And everybody will be very curious about that one. I hope we got a zoom in of Dave's face there. We have about 1 minute left, so can either of you briefly, the governor has asked for the Labor Relations Board to weigh in on whether there is an impasse with AFSCME. We have seen now legislators take another swing at the bat. Rauner, Dave, real quick, can you get there with this arbitration news?
The legislature is going to try to run another bill that would send things to arbitration, and the governor doesn't want it because he thinks that stacks the deck in favor of the unions.
And we're waiting for information from the Labor Relations Board. I have checked in and no updates yet. That process could take months on whether or not there's an impasse. And I mean, if there is one declared, that could lead to a strike. So we've got all sorts of news there. But that's about all the time that we have got for this episode. If you want to be like Barack Obama, go and get yourself some barley soup at the feed store. That is where he stopped before heading to the Capitol. And sorry for all of you fellow horseshoe lovers, if you're like me and just love fries and some homemade cheese sauce. Obama said he doesn't miss the horseshoes from being in the city of Springfield. So go get yourself either barley soup or a horseshoe on Obama's behalf. With that, thanks so much to WTAX State House reporter Dave Dahl and Illinois Issues and NPR Illinois' Brian Mackey. I am Amanda Vinicky. Check us out on Facebook. That's at Capitol View Politics.